So Dr. Jorell Melendez Badillo is an assistant professor of Latin American and Caribbean history at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. His work focuses on the global circulation of radical ideas from the standpoint of working class intellectual communities. His most recent book, Puerto Rico and National History, offers an accessible introduction to Puerto Rico, its history, and the contemporary political moment. He holds a doctorate in history from the University of Connecticut and has a master's and a bachelor's at Inter-American University in Puerto Rico. He recently collaborated with Bad Bunny on the release of his most recent album, Debí Tirar Más Fotos, where he was contacted and he created 17 narratives for YouTube visualizers of the songs of the new album as they were released. And so, very, very interesting historical facts for each of the songs. And he worked with the team in picking the topics. And it was a labor of love in the middle of his vacation. So, he can tell you more about it later. But it's very interesting collaboration. So, he can give us a little bit of insight of that process too. Dr. Aurora Santiago Ortiz is an assistant professor of gender and women's studies and Chicana Latina studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on anti-racist feminisms, the colonial perspectives, and participatory action research, and her work has been published in the Michigan Journal for Community Service and Learning, the Italian Journal of Urban Studies, Curriculum Inquiry, the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, Centro Journal, Anthropology and Education Quarterly, and the Chicana Latina Studies Journal. She holds a doctorate in social justice education from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So they're kind of local until a few years ago here in Connecticut and New England. We're sad that they left us, but we're very happy for where they are and very excited for where their our academic careers is taking them and will take them in the future. And we're very excited that they were able to make some time in their busy schedule to come here to the university, to Central, and give us a little bit of their, scholarly conversations and sort of this interesting talk on the whole Bad Bunny enigma, right? It's part of the chapter they broke for that book. So without any further ado, Jorel and Aurora.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, gracias. All right. How are we feeling? Thank you for being here. It's 5:16 on a Wednesday. I know it's late in the day, so we'll try to make this as engaging as possible. My name is Aurora. Buenas tardes. Santiago Ortiz. She, her, ella. And we were super happy to be here with you to talk about Benito and his impact on Puerto Rican culture and discourse. Before I do that, I want to thank Dr. Reynaldo Rojas for the invitation and Melody Lozano for coordinating logistics. So thank you so much. And it's sort of a homecoming, as Dr. Rojas mentioned, to be back in Connecticut, where we lived for a couple of years and actually got married 9 years and 5 days ago today. So we got married here in Connecticut. So who's counting? I'm going to present the first part, so I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes before handing it over to Jorel. And so, here we are, perfect. No, not yet. So, the presentation is called Nostalgic Memory in Bad Bunny's Por Siempre, sort of the earlier work. And this draws from the chapter that we wrote, but it sort of differs from it as well. So for many of us, Bad Bunny's first full-length album, Por Siempre, cemented our love or fandom of his music. Released on Nochebuena or Christmas Eve in 2018, the album experimented with diverse musical genres, including pop punk, trap, reggaeton, bachata, among others. Lyrically, the album was full of references to how it was como antes, like before. A nostalgic nod to an idealized past that includes memories of past loves, childhood games, and popular Latin American music that many of us listened to in the 90s. That is, those of us who were around during that time, because not all of us were here. And so this construction of what Jorel and I called nostalgic memory has allowed Benito to reach an intergenerational audience in Puerto Rico, the US, Latin America, its diasporas beyond. So, what we term nostalgic memory refers to this personal and collective nostalgia of events that we have experienced both directly and indirectly. That is, Bad Bunny weaves his own personal childhood memories and coming of age with that of a collective experience of these memories that we could all tune into. And so I'm going to play a snippet of the song Como Antes to sort of illustrate this intersection of the personal and the collective, of direct and indirect nostalgia. So, perfect. Perfect. And so the song manufactures an idyllic shared past that is rooted in the impossibility of a return to it. For those of you who weren't there or did not experience it, Benito invites you into it, even though you weren't there, making you a witness to his memory making, but also in a collective sense. And so for those of us that were there or that experienced these things, we can connect to going to Blockbuster to rent a movie, right? How many of us have been to Blockbuster? Okay, so good. The excitement of watching a boxing match with other people, rooting for our own Tito Trinidad, and listening to Shakira during our teenage years full of angst and longing, as well as during our young adulthood. So coming of age in the 90s also meant, and I'll say this because Bad Bunny did really come of age in the 90s. He was born in 94, so he was a baby in the 90s. But these are also experiences of coming of age that he sort of imprinted as a young child, but also later on in the early 2000s, right? And so coming of age in the 90s, for those of us that did, also meant like for those of us that could and did have access, having a Game Boy, having MySpace and Messenger. And so these were middle class symbols that provided windows into the world of that was among us, but also beyond us. Like we were able to connect with other people. However, Bad Bunny's nostalgic memory also conjured a problematic past that glosses over the archipelago's racist, sexist, and homophobic past and present. For those of us who grew up in Puerto Rico or visited frequently, Los Simpsons was on at 4. We would know that at 4 o'clock you could see The Simpsons, but dubbed in Spanish. And Y Pal Cuatro a las 6, so Channel 4 at 6 o'clock, referring to after school and primetime TV local programming. At 6 o'clock, La Comay was on Guapa TV. La Comay, which means comadre, right? Short for comadre, meaning close friend or godmother, was a puppet voiced by Antulio Cobo Santa Rosa and was a continuation of other gossip puppet characters from the 80s, La Cháchara, or the Tattler, and La Condesa del Bochinche, the Countess of Gossip. La Comay was featured on Super Exclusivo, a gossip program that covered often tawdry and salacious stories ranging from politics to crime. The show sensationalized murders, often blaming the victim for their demise, as was the case of publicist Jose Enrique González Saladín. González Saladín was brutally murdered in 2012, and La Comay inflamed speculation by insinuating that he deserved to die because he was in an area known to be frequented by sex workers. Dozens of Latino organizations in the archipelago and the U.S. called for the boycott of the program, including GLAAD, the National Puerto Rican Coalition, the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, the National Hispanic Media Coalition, the National Conference of Puerto Rican Women, and prominent queer, anti-racist, and civil rights leaders in Puerto Rico also called for this boycott and the cancellation of the program. A Facebook page called Boycott La Comay was created, along with a petition calling for the boycott of the program, and it had more than 72,000 signatures. In late 2012, including myself, corporations began pulling their ads from the program, and the show was finally canceled on January 9th, 2013. Besides including this allusion to Super Exclusivo in his lyrics, Bad Bunny used the puppet to announce his first major tour. Super Exclusivo had been canceled for 5 years at that point, and Benito's decision to revive the puppet drew much criticism. It presented a cognitive dissonance between Bad Bunny's seemingly queer aesthetic and non-normative masculinity and the simultaneous use of nostalgic memory of a time past that was neither politically correct nor did attempt to present a Puerto Rico that broke with its past and present racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and racist mainstream culture. Benito defended this decision in an interview stating, quote, "I know all the controversy and I know everything it caused at one point. But at the end of the day, it's a character that was very much present in Puerto Rico's popular culture," end quote. He remembered walking home from school and all of the houses in his neighborhood were tuning in. And he explained that there were no characters like La Comaya on Puerto Rican TV. There's nothing sort of emblematic that did what she did. And since I was not there in the 90s, I wasn't an artist in the 2000s. I am now. So it is interesting to me to think about what would have happened if I was famous 10 years ago and La Comay would have shared some gossip about me. You feel me? I'm using her for something positive, but God knows what sort of nonsense would have been said about me. It's interesting to note that he himself knew that he would most likely have been the target of the puppet. I wonder if he would have then been part of the boycott. On January 28, 2019, La Comay came back on air. This time with a new host and a new name to the show. Where Super Exclusivo's co-host was Hector Travieso, the new show, how do you say eponymously? Eponymously, thank you. I never hear that word. I always read it. Titled La Comay, was co-hosted by Rocky the Kid, who is also a radio personality and a TV personality. Once again, Santa Rosa used this platform to denigrate Black public figures, such as Black feminist politician, lawyer, and activist leader Ana Irma Rivera Lacen. This is what Santa Rosa said through the puppet, and now I'm going to give a content warning. Now attorney Ana Rivera Lacen will go to Alexandra Lugaro, who was another candidate for the governor position, and will say in a very pronounced Black servant accent that is a combination of gibberish and some slang, "My boss lady, look, you are here, listen, my friend," laughter clips come in, it's like a laugh track, "but you know, my friend, my girl, go to sleep, my little girl, go to sleep," as if Lugaro were a little child, and Rivera Lacen was the help. And so obviously I'm not going to do the voice. It was a very mocking voice. And so you had a laugh track happening and nothing changed, right, after this. A whole bunch of people denounced it and were calling for that boycott once again. And so nothing changed as well in thinking about Bad Bunny's song. Sigue siendo hoy. It is still today, as Bad Bunny sang, but it is also ayer, yesterday, right? Puerto Rico's lack of reckoning with its racist, sexist, and homophobic past and present allowed the show to be revived, in part thanks to Bad Bunny. And there was another instance where former gubernatorial candidate Alexandra Lugaro's daughter, who was about 11 or 12 at the time, was sexualized by Santa Rosa on the show with a picture, presenting a picture of a minor. And so calls for another boycott were swift. And this is can you go back? This quote that was here, it was in Latino Rebels. I didn't put the source, but this is a translation. Obviously, it was in Spanish. And so this other one was Pedro Julio Serrano, who's a prominent queer activist in Puerto Rico, this is the actual clip where La Comaya, didn't want to show it because it's horrible, was talking about Ana Irma Rivera Lacen. But Pedro Julio Serrano, who was big in the first boycott in 2012, was saying, "Ya basta, enough is enough. This racism, misogynism, homophobia, and hate needs to end. In the past, we already took Cobo Santa Rosa out of TV. It's time to take him out again. Boycott Cobo. I make a call that the page Boycott La Comay gets activated once again. But the show continued despite the backlash. Finally, in January of this year, 2025, 6 years too late, 20 years too late, Santa Rosa retired the puppet from TV. La Comay wasn't an exceptional voice on the TV landscape, but a magnifying glass that exemplified the coloniality of power and gender, or the enduring systems of domination based on race, gender, class that began with colonial conquest and are alive in the present. These systems of oppression, are hidden behind a cultural nationalism in the archipelago that views all Puerto Ricans as belonging to one great Puerto Rican family. Articulated by the archipelago's intellectual elite during the 30s through literature, historical narratives, and other cultural projects that went on, the great Puerto Rican family myth reproduced patriarchal, sexist, and colonial discourses under the veil of unity through a racial mixture of the indigenous person, the African, and the Spaniard. And we can see that from textbooks all the way to the ways that literature is learned throughout school and in the media. Bad Bunny's nostalgic memory is an extension of this trope, and even if unintentionally, his incorporation of La Comay in his tour promotion amplified and reproduced heteropatriarchal and sexist violence, even if it was unintentionally. After the controversy around Lugaro's daughter, Benito tweeted, "First of all, I want to be clear that I did not bring back La Comay. I don't produce their program. I paid to use the doll, which had not been used in years, for a 60-second ad without knowing or even imagining that it would come back. Do not associate me with whatever garbage Santa Rosa says in their program." Bad Bunny's distancing from La Comay was viewed by many as damage control or too little too late. And so for what's left of my time, I now want to turn to Bad Bunny's visual representations of nostalgic memory during the Por Siempre tour. So as you know, he used the puppet to announce the tour. And so this was Bad Bunny's first major headlining tour. And March 10th, 2019, on his birthday, I attended the sold-out concert. And he was not originally set to perform that evening, but added this third and final show as a gift, given that the first two nights were sold out. Before the concert started, a video introduction of a show called No Te Duermas was projected onto the arena's giant screens. For those of us who grew up in Puerto Rico during the 90s, we immediately recognized the introduction to the show, featuring host Antonio Sanchez, known as El Gangster. And so No Te Duermas was a late-night comedy talk show featuring a slew of different characters performing skits that usually employed racist, homophobic, and sexist tropes, either played by Sanchez or other comedic actors. While Sanchez was the mainstay male host, No Te Duermas featured a revolving door of conventionally attractive women co-hosts during the show's 18-year run, as well as what they called El Poder de la Semana, or the Power of the Week. El Poder de la Semana video segment featured models, aspiring actresses, and vedettes, which are another word for sex symbols, that became tabloid fodder in the archipelago, or a combination of all three. The intro to the skit performed at Bad Bunny's concert featured Sanchez as host, dressed in costumes that represented the other characters that he played, and a woman's body is seen gyrating, but her face is never seen, which tells you a lot about how they view women on the program. The fictional No Te Duermas episode featured two guests in this opening to the concert. Up-and-coming rapper Giancarlo Santiago, known as El Guayna, and internet celebrity Dagmar Flores Enriquez. Does anybody know who that is? Dagmar Flores Enriquez, otherwise known as La Vampi de Lajas. The personas of the two artists cannot be more opposite. The first emerged as the protege of reggaeton global superstar Daddy Yankee, and the second garnered visibility and notoriety in the archipelago and Puerto Rican diaspora as a YouTuber and vlogger long before TikTok and Instagram Reels became in vogue. La Vampi, however, vastly departs from the heteronormativity and ode to conventional beauty that was intrinsic to No Te Duermas. Her thick curves, sexy demeanor, and sense of self presents a different kind of vedette. Self-fashioned, unabashed, and as Josiana Arroyo says, a small diva with non-traditional looks and a zaftig body that runs counter to the ideal that has been thrust upon mainstream viewers, end quote. Part parody, part nostalgia, La Vampi's pairing with El Guayna in the No Te Duermas skit shown on the night of March 10th was undoubtedly meant to provide comic relief while simultaneously showcasing a different kind of femininity and gender script. So I have a little of that piece. The video is horrible because it's recorded from the concert. So we can, okay, so that is part of the skit. So you'll see now. Ahí está. So La Vampi's subversion of gender norms shown by her assuming the male role in her perreo, grinding, behind El Guayna, as well as her taking an active role with El Gangster when he began to grind on her, which we didn't see. Ultimately making him fall on the iconic lip-shit couches of the set, departed from the original show's presentation of feminine sexuality. This subversion was short-lived, however. Immediately after, we see a snippet of Guayna performing what would become his most famous solo track, Rebota. The screen fades out in and in again to show the audience the most popular segment, El Poder de la Semana. This skit was only shown during the Puerto Rico dates of the tour. Although No Te Duermas had been off air for 11 years, the show is part of the archipelago's collective memory. The recreated set with a live studio, intergenerational audience was not exactly how it was before, yet evoked a sense of nostalgia for many of those in attendance. Bad Bunny paid homage to the show via the concert opening video because he was a fan as a child of the show, which is interesting because it's like a lot of half-naked women, and he's probably like 5 or 6 years old just watching that. As he mentioned in the one-night revival of the show No Te Duermas, Una Noche Más on August 31st, 2019. Both La Comay and No Te Duermas are examples of deployments of nostalgic memory that maintain a view of the past tinted by rose-colored glasses that fails to grapple with its problematic and violent past, and reproduces the gender, class, and racial hierarchies that are already present in the archipelago. They are an echo and a window into the political class that manages the colony. They are not the cultural exception, but the norm in most instances. And this was evident when the 800-plus pages of the Telegram chat leaked, where ex-governor Ricardo Rosselló and his cronies were making fun of the dead after Maria, articulating ableist comments and mocking public and private figures for being black, queer, and or women. Although Bad Bunny called for Rosselló's resignation and threatened to pull his music from the Spanish broadcasting system if something was not done about La Comay, he still provided a platform to 2 highly controversial programs that ridiculed the most marginalized sectors of Puerto Rican society. And he has since missed multiple opportunities to interrupt the myth of the great Puerto Rican family and to problematize his past. And while it is not his responsibility to repair the harms of the shows, he does have the power to problematize them and not glorify a past that was harmful to others, even if he did not experience these acts of violence firsthand. As a public figure, we have witnessed Benito's growth and critical consciousness of colonialism, displacement, and sexism. Indeed, as Jorell will discuss, Benito today is not the one that we saw and began to love 7, 8, 9 years ago, and it shows in Debí Tirar Más Fotos. And so I will end here and then pass it on to Jorell. Thank you so much.
Buenas tardes. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to take the mic and I'm going to walk. Thank you for being here. And so first and foremost, I would like to begin by extending my gratitude. Can you hear well? Perfecto. To my dear colleague, Reynaldo Roja, Dr. Reynaldo Roja, for the invitation. I'm also grateful to the support of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies program here at Central Connecticut State University, and we're thankful for your invitation, for having us here. Also, especially to Melody Lozano for all her support organizing this event and her travels. We're very excited to be back here. I just wanted to note that tomorrow I'm going to be delivering a more formal historical lecture about Puerto Rico's history, the teaching of history, and what I call the politics of forgetting in Puerto Rico. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Bad Bunny's historical memory, particularly in his last album, Debí Tirar Más Foto. So let's just start with it. So as historian Marcelo Luzzi notes, la memoria or memory is the presence or the eruption of the past in the present. That is, la memoria is tied to historical thinking in the ways that both history and memory are meditations between the past and the present. For Bad Bunny, welcome, hola, hola, nostalgia has been a way to connect to an idealized past, as Professor Santiago Ortiz has noted in her presentation. If we think of songs like Bendiciones from the album Las que no iban a salir, there's always a longing to be part of another reality. He argues in that song, and I quote, Hoy me levanté con ganas de abrazar a mami, de janguear bien loco por Miami. I woke up feeling that I wanted to hug my mother, to be hanging out in Miami. Or we think about the last song of the album, Yo hago lo que me da la gana. He argues, and I quote, Hablando claro, gente, ya ni duermo, y esto de la fama ya me tiene hasta enfermo. Gracias a mamá y a papá por todos los regaños, gracias a ustedes, sigo siendo el mismo todos los años. Recuerdo, castigado me iba a la cama, por eso ahora hago lo que me da la gana. Talking truth, I don't sleep anymore, and this fame thing has me sick. Thanks, Mom and Dad, for all the times that you regañarme. How do you say? You scolded me. Thanks to you, I keep being the same. I remember how I went to my bed when I was scolded. That's why now I do whatever I want. And so the nostalgic ethos that permeates his catalog also connects with the topic that I want to talk during my time today, Bad Bunny's historical memory. And by historical memory, I refer to the ways that Benito articulates a historical discourse or cultural project, for there's also a sensibility and aesthetic project tied to it, that seeks to use the past to intervene in the present. And to explore this, I'll turn to his most recent album, Debí Tirar Más Foto. So perhaps you were one of the millions of people who on January 5th, 2025, turned to YouTube to stream Bad Bunny's new album, Debí Tirar Más Fotos. And so there you found that there are 17 visualizers with historical narratives about Puerto Rican history. And so in my time today, I will expand upon these visualizers, which I had the privilege of working in and writing. And I want to do two things. I want to talk about the importance of the album in the moment that it came out. And I also want to talk about the political contours of Debí Tirar Más Fotos, particularly in its proposal of democratizing access to Puerto Rico's history. So every time I give a talk or a lecture about Puerto Rico outside of the archipelago, I begin with the same note. Puerto Rico is a Caribbean and Latin American country colonized by the Spanish from 1493 to 1898 and by the United States since then. Because of its ambiguous legal nature, it is oftentimes difficult to locate Puerto Rico within different fields of knowledge. Grappling with Puerto Rican history forces us to grapple and face this country's history of colonialism and imperialism. Oftentimes, we don't know how to describe Puerto Rico. Is it a commonwealth? Yes. Is it a territory? Yes. Is it a colony? Yes. And if you may, I'm going to cite the Supreme Court of the United States in a series of Supreme Court cases that were decided from 1901 to 1921. Puerto Rico belongs to, but it's not part of the United States. Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the United States, and Puerto Rico is foreign in a domestic sense. That is still the rule of the land. That is the series of cases that still dictate the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And so I say this because historians, intellectuals, and cultural producers cannot escape the reality of the moment in which they live in. We are intrinsically tied to the context that gives life to our imaginaries and our thoughts. Even if we try to flee from such realities, our experiences shape our worldviews. I am part of a Puerto Rican generation that was robbed of any possibility of a future. Those of us born in the 1980s witnessed Puerto Rico emerging from an economic crisis in the 1970s. And without fully understanding its implications, we saw the privatization of our healthcare system and hospitals in the 1990s. In that decade, we read about dozens of political officials being arrested, some after looting funds from the healthcare and education systems. We were stunned when the Twin Towers fell on September 11, 2001. We knew that something would change, but we did not realize yet that this event would reorganize global geopolitics. On May 1st, 2006, we heard on the radio that the government of Puerto Rico was shutting down operations for 2 weeks after failing to reach a national budget agreement. I thought perhaps naively that things could not get worse in Puerto Rico. However, the generation that political scientists, Mayra Vélez Serrano, a professor of political sciences at the University of Puerto Rico, has called the crisis generation, and that I wrote for in La Mudanza Visualizer for Bad Bunny's record, those born in the late 1990s and early 2000s in Puerto Rico inherited a Puerto Rico that is bankrupt, in crisis, and under austerity. This generation that Mayra Vélez Serrano calls the crisis generation, not only was it robbed of its future, as it had happened to us, but it's also actively being deprived of its present. In the rest of my time, I would like to briefly address another element at play within this ongoing crisis, which is memory and the ability to think about our past, that is, our historical memory. In a reflection of the recent Portuguese translation of Arcadio Díaz Quiñones' La Memoria Rota, The Broken Memory, Arcadio Díaz Quiñones notes that at times artists create other memories that challenge and contrast collective memories. Puerto Rico, argued Arcadio Díaz Quiñones, broke away with its collective memories in the 1940s and 50s to create a new collective memory. And I argue in my work that in 2006, with the start of the crisis, there was an epistemic rupture in Puerto Rico. We have a state that is not capable of producing a new collective memory. And this has also materialized in the fact that in 2015, the Puerto Rican government attempted to eliminate the teaching of history in the country's public schools. Some schools in Puerto Rico now only teach history in the senior year of high school. And the University of Puerto Rico has been the target of attacks by different government administrations, by the Fiscal Oversight Board that controls Puerto Rico, and internal groups in the form of clans that take advantage of the university's bureaucracy to advance their agendas. In January of this year, of 2025, just days before Debí Tirar Más Fotos was released, former president of the University of Puerto Rico, Luis Aferrao, a historian by trade, announced that they were planning on shutting down 64 academic units in the university, including, of course, history. This was overturned, and he was forced to resign, but it is telling how the state thinks about the teaching of history. And so, as I mentioned, artists and cultural producers in Puerto Rico are not detached from these realities that I'm talking about. Some decide to ignore the context that they're living in, while other artists and cultural producers are deeply connected and aware of it, incorporating it into their artistic and cultural production. This isn't new in Puerto Rico. We've had La Canción Protesta, we've had contesting art, but I argue that what Bad Bunny's doing is on another scale. And here we have El Espíritu del Corte from Puerto Rico Negrex, because as I'll talk about tomorrow, I argue, and Aurora Santiago Ortiz also argues in her work, that it is through art that we're seeing other memories being formed in Puerto Rico and other prefigurative futures that are being articulated in pieces like Daniel Lin Ramos' El Espíritu del Corte. But back to Bad Bunny. I argue that Bad Bunny is doing this at another scale. Bad Bunny is part of the cultural stratosphere in the world of pop, clashing and butting elbows with people like Beyonce or, ¿cómo se llama esta mujer, la rubia? Taylor Swift, or Taylor Swift. And so you have someone that is doing this at one of the highest levels of the pop world. And this is Benito Martinez Ocasio at the 2019 protest in Puerto Rico, the Verano 2019 protest, alongside Ricky Martin, Residente, PJ Cinzuela, and other peoples that have been part of the protest movement. And again, other artists have done this. They have used their platforms to talk about Puerto Rico's political moment. This has been done by Residente or artists like PJ Cinzuela, who have written political songs and records for years now. This is further the case if we think about the underground hip-hop scene in Puerto Rico with artists from Tech One to 79 and Intifada. But again, he's doing it at another level. And as Tito Auger, the singer of Fiera La Vega, a Puerto Rican rock band, argued recently, Benito no tenía por qué hacer esto. He did not have to do this. Bad Bunny is part of a generation of artists that are exploring new sensibilities of what it means to be Puerto Rican, including artists like Villano Antillano, Rainao, Cita, or Baby Pau. These are artists that are exploring other forms of sexuality and belonging in Puerto Rico as they navigate multiple compounding crises, from Hurricane Maria to the shutting down of 400 schools in the archipelago, to the forced exodus of Puerto Ricans, to the Verano 2019. As Cita, who you see there on the right, argues, quise jugar con las narrativas de lo que hay dentro del género sobre las mujeres, que muchas veces son contadas por hombres. Yo quise apoderarme de esas narrativas, hacerlas mías y contarlas a mi manera. So Cita, one of the artists of this generation, is arguing that she wanted to play with the narratives that are within the genre of reggaeton because women are oftentimes invisibilized and their stories are told through the voices of men. She wanted to appropriate those narratives, making it hers, and to tell them in her own voice. So it is within this kaleidoscope that we can locate Bad Bunny's new album, Debí Tirar Más Fotos. As journalist Benjamin Torres Gotay has noted, the album serves as a snapshot of the current political moment in Puerto Rico. That is, it can be read as an archive. In it, Benito is not creating a new discourse, but amplifying ongoing conversations in Puerto Rico about displacement, about colonialism, and about national affirmation. And so we'll come back to this, but let me talk briefly about my collaboration with Benito, because one of the conversations that we have was very telling about his own conceptualizations of history. To start, I have to say that I'm a huge fan, and I'm a huge fan since the time of Amorfoda. I don't know if that tells anything to anyone here. But I've seen him multiple times in a gas station concert in Puerto Rico, to stadiums in Chicago, New York, Montreal, and Miami. I don't know if I'm missing any. I've also worked on Bad Bunny from a scholarly perspective with Professor Aurora Santiago Ortiz. We published a chapter on nostalgia and historical memory in the Bad Bunny Enigma. And so I say that because I've been thinking about Bad Bunny for some time. And so on December 24th, on December 24th, 2024, I was asked by his team to create 17 historical narratives to accompany the songs in YouTube. So visualizers are made by artists to monetize on the platform of YouTube, and oftentimes they have a short video that's presented on loop. And so Benito, what he wanted to do was to use that platform to amplify Puerto Rican history. And in the process, I got to write histories of Puerto Rican women, histories of the Puerto Rican working classes, about the history of repression and surveillance, which Benito himself asked me to write about, all the way to the general history of Puerto Rico, because as he told me, general histories of Puerto Rico are unknown, even for Puerto Ricans. And so he was very interested in using his platform. And another thing that he told me is that he was not interested in me writing these narratives for the students at the University of Puerto Rico because they do have access to it. He was interested in people from the caseríos, the projects, and las barriadas, the working class neighborhoods, to be able to access Puerto Rican history. And the outcome was absolutely wild. These videos have been viewed more than 450 million times. And it's a work of public scholarship that it was not ideated by me. It was not created. It was Benito's idea. But back to Benito, one of the things that really interested me in working with Bad Bunny was that he was using his platform to amplify Puerto Rican history, one, and that the locus of enunciation for Benito is Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in the Puerto Rican diaspora. That is, he is speaking to us first and foremost. And I wanted to bring this example of when he received the VMA for Best Artist, the first time that a Spanish-speaking artist received this award, and he received it in a sold-out Yankee Stadium the same night that he kissed a male singer on stage, a male dancer on stage. And so there was a lot of conversation in the United States about what this meant. Some people called him out because that was queer baiting. But what people missed is that 2 days prior to this, there had been an event in Puerto Rico in which a trans artist, Villano Antillano, had kissed Toquicha, a Dominican rapper, in a small club in Puerto Rico. And a lot of people in the reggaeton music scene were criticizing Villano Antillano and Toquicha. And Bad Bunny was simply responding to something that was happening in Puerto Rico, using the biggest platform in the world. However, he was still speaking to a very particular Puerto Rican experience. And he also used history and politics to speak to Puerto Ricans. And so he's amplifying conversations that are happening in the archipelago around colonialism, around displacement, and around cultural gentrification. And I bring these pictures from the GGK collective because one of the things that I'm really interested in is the ways that walls become sort of a bulletin board for how people feel. And so you can see these all around the metropolitan area and all throughout the archipelago. And so these are some of the same sensibilities that get reproduced in Benito's work, and particularly in Debí Tirar Más Foto. Songs like Lo que le pasó a Hawaii or the music video for La Mudanza, for example, showcase a historical sensibility in Benito's work. Here you have on your top right some people using wooden rifles. That is in reference, and I know that firsthand, that is in reference to the Ponce Massacre in Puerto Rico, which was an event from the Nationalist Party in 1936. And so the video came out around the time that we were celebrating the anniversary of the Ponce Massacre. So in very subtle ways, Benito is incorporating all these historical reference into the conversation. And so the last thing I'll say is that, again, one of the most important things and aspects of Debí Tirar Más Foto for me is the ways that it's democratizing the access to Puerto Rican history. At a moment when the University of Puerto Rico is under attack and the president almost shut down the history program at the premier institution of higher learning in Puerto Rico, at a moment when there's a lack of history education in our classrooms, at a moment in which, as I'll explain tomorrow in further detail, there is a politics of forgetting articulated from the state, Benito is using his platform to amplify our history and our culture. There is a changing tide in Puerto Rico, particularly after the last election cycle, when independents won the second place in the ballot box. And argue that Benito is thinking from that space. He is conscious of the moment that he is living in Puerto Rico. So the album is a celebration of Puerto Ricanness, but it also documents the pains and tribulations of our current political moment. Muchas gracias. So we have time for questions, comments, critiques, attacks.
No, no time for attacks.
So again, the floor is open, and you want to add to the conversation, or you want to ask any questions, or any kind of reaction to what they're saying, what speaks to you, or whatever.
The only thing is that I'm gonna pass the mic so it gets recorded in the.
I noticed you mentioned a lot of new female Puerto Rican artists, and I didn't see young Miko up there, so I was wondering what you have to say. I think she's really like blown up, and no one has thought anything like that would come out of some little girl like that.
Remember to raise your voice. I mean, because the mic is not really.
Okay, yeah. I was just mentioning, I wanted to hear what you had to think about young Miko, who is a new emerging female reggaeton artist, but she's also part of the queer community.
Yeah. I don't know
Why did you not include young Miko in the pictures?
Yeah.
That's the question.
I only have love for young Miko. I think that one of the things that I wanted to do was to also represent up and coming artists and underground artists like Baby Pao, who is, from the underground queer scene and ballroom scene. Baby Pao, who was there. Also Sita, who's also coming from the queer community. I think that Yamiko already she exploded into the stratosphere as well, in part. And so that was the logic behind including these other folks rather than young Miko. But it's, she was the first openly, lesbian reggaeton singer, because we've had people, La Potra, Ivy Queen, that I think there's some queerness there and some vagueness on purpose on the way that she projects her femininity. But Yomiko is very open and explicit about it, right? And so she was the first one, but I think that people know young Miko, and they don't know Rainao or Villana in the same way. And so I was just trying to amplify those other folks that are part of sort of the same group and movement. But I think that Yamiko transcended in terms of market, in terms of reach.
And also, what do you have to say about Anuel's platform being almost the entire opposite of Bad Bunny's? And how I have been in lots of arguments on Instagram today with Puerto Ricans about this conservatism. It seems that what is he doing?
Not much.
Well, I think there's a spectrum. Like not everybody is. Am I cool here? Great. I think that like with any music and any entertainers, there are entertainers that are going to be more critically conscious or aware or bring a message, and then there's people who are in it for money, fame, and all those things. And so, Anuel can't even go to Puerto Rico because they're looking for him.
In the
And-
streets.
And so yeah, I think but it's not also Anuel. It's Daddy Yankee also endorsed McCain back in the day, and then we have Nicky Jam also doing that. I mean, everybody's different. Not everyone is comes from that same thing, but also like I think in terms of thinking about right now and thinking about a lot of the other folks that are in the queer community, there's another sensibility in there, right? An experience of marginalization that's very particular. I'm not saying that Bad Bunny has experienced that. I think that Bad Bunny has been around people who have been able to sort of guide him through an awareness that at the beginning wasn't there. I also think that once he broke away from his original record label, he had much more freedom to pursue certain aesthetics. And I don't think that the painting of the nails and his choices are necessarily ways to capitalize and only speak to a queer audience. I think that it's things that he liked to do.
I think that this album, I've noticed my mother and a lot of her friends did not like Bad Bunny. They thought he was too vulgar. But this album, they really started to be like, wow, he's a very amazing, talented artist, really thoughtful.
Yeah, my mom's going to the concert. So I had to get her a ticket, which was very difficult, but yeah. Yeah.
One last thing I would like to say about Anuel is that, there's I look at this two ways. So the first one is that, although Anuel comes from the sort of the world of trap, which is more like the equivalent of like gangster rap in terms of like talking about drugs and guns and all these sorts of things, there's a political element there also in bragging about having made it. And so I think that, there is something political there, but ideologically, it's, he's very conservative. And I think that, for me, thinking about Anuel's endorsement of Donald Trump in this and Justin Quiles, and it also shattered the myth of the Latino vote as homogenous. And so even in a place like Pennsylvania, you have, even in the Puerto Rican community, there's also questions there about, patterns of migration, patterns of assimilation. There's all these conversations that I think shattered this myth of like the Latinos vote as a bloc. And I think that Anuel, is not I don't claim Anuel, but he's representative of certain groups in our communities that think that way. Yeah. And so, yeah.
Acá.
Oh, do you want the student to go first? Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have to speak to this, right? So I was one of those. I wasn't a big Bad Bunny fan at all. I think this album changed it for me, and part of the reason why it changed it to me, something that you said, right, sort of speaking to those members of the diaspora group. I grew up on El Gran Combo, right, and these references, the music that he is, right, I guess, what's that called when you appropriate, not appropriate, but when you sample, yeah, and you mix and what have you, it's like, it's familiar to me, right? So I think that's part of the reason it brings back that memory, that nostalgic view and what have you. So something that you said in terms of the growth and the critical consciousness is also that appeals to me, right? Aside from feeling good about the music I grew up with, because it is about the memory, right? But it's also, I think, a little bit of a call to action. So I guess I would like to kind of maybe interrogate that a little bit more. Like if you had to say, what's the call to action? Because when we think about memory and nostalgia, that's great, but it's in the past, right? We have to then think about the current state of affairs and what it will mean in the future. So I guess I'm just curious from your standpoint, what would that call to action be if there's been such a critical consciousness that has happened with him as an artist? So how do we sort of create that larger critical consciousness?
Absolutely. Yeah, I could start and then you can
Okay.
go ahead. No, thank
Tiene
you.
que aguantar.
Thank you for those comments and the question. I think that, for me, it was really important that Benito begins this album in New York. The first thing that you hear in the album is Nueva York. And so he's locating the record in the Puerto Rican diaspora and paying homage the same way that I think that Un Verano Sin Ti was an homage to the Caribbean and those sounds and whatnot. So I appreciate the comment on the diaspora. And also in terms of call to action, I think that, Puerto Rico politicizes anyone that lives through Puerto Rico, the power outages. And he had been thinking about this, El Apagón, that includes that 20-something minute documentary. So he's thinking about the political dimensions of what he's living. I think the elections that just happened in Puerto Rico in November were crucial. So Benito participated as a private individual, paying for ads throughout Puerto Rico to position himself in opposition to the party of the Partido Nuevo Progresista, el PNP. And he paid for banners that said something along the lines of, a vote for the PNP, it's a vote for corruption. Every time you lose power in Puerto Rico, remember it's the PNP's fault. And so he's locating himself within this sort of broader coalition movement, which had independence at its core. And so I don't want to claim that Benito's an independentista. I hope and I wish. And if I ever get to meet him in person, I will continue vouching for independence. But I think that he's thinking about the current political moment in Puerto Rico, and there are things happening. And so he supported those things, at least on an electoral level in the past elections.
I think it goes before that, because I think that one of my theories is that his partner, ex-partner, we don't know where they are right now in their relationship, was a very she was a very big figure in his own intellectual development and thought process about what was happening, his friendship with Residente. So I think of for about, like, after Maria, like, I think there's also a thing of pride. I think one of the reasons why the summer of the 2019 those protests were so successful and galvanizing is because in Puerto Rico, and I'm not saying that this is better than other reasons, but I think that's the reality, we are very proud. And I think that the corruption didn't mobilize people. And I think, like, I think the thing that mobilized people was an affront to people's dignity. And I think that's what mobilized people in 2019, because look at what these people are saying about us. This is like a disrespect to our core. And so I think he starts to also be galvanized there. His friendship with Residente during that time, the song that they wrote and sang, which is Afilando Cuchillos, very political. So I don't think that it's now. I think it's been a process around Maria. One thing I didn't mention that we mentioned in the chapter is that there was a trans femicide in, I think, 2019 or 20 or maybe 18 or 19 of Alexa, no Lisa, who was an unhoused trans woman who was also Black, murdered, and it was, like, recorded. And so when he went on Jimmy Fallon and sang, he had a shirt on that said, and he wore a skirt and said it wasn't a man in a skirt who was murdered. Her name was Alexa. And so already, like, he was thinking about all these things, and I don't want to attribute it to, like, people around him alone. You know, I think he's also very much interested in that. And to really also platform, you know, the crisis of trans femicides and femicides, because in Por Siempre we have a song, La que dice no me vuelvas a decir bebé, about a woman who in the video she gets beaten by an invisible hand. So I think these issues were already on his radar. I think that he is grasping more language to sort of talk about those things. I think it's cool when people don't know about something, they don't need to say anything. But, like, once you learn and you read and you know, and I think that's when he felt more comfortable using that platform. So I would also invite you to listen to his earlier albums too, because I think that there are songs that are really, you know, wonderful and with depth and with meaning, and they're also fun. And I think a lot of debates that are talked about within his music is like, oh, he's disrespecting women, he's being a misogynist, but talking with the youths, you know, and I enjoy the music. I think it's also a very different view of sexuality and of sex, of having agency, right? And talking about and singing about these things. And also the women, you know, women and femmes having agency in these lyrics. And I think it's also sparked a lot of good conversations about that as well, and the sex positivity, and also, you know, saying, like, yes, you could do better. And he has also changed his lyrics. So he doesn't, you know, say puta in his songs anymore. He changed, you know, the way. And I think that's, you know, I think that's cool in the ways that, you know, he's open to changing, you know, in general.
I have two questions, if that's all right. One question is back to when he included those, like, problematic skits in his tour. Did he know at the time that they were problematic, or was he kind of blinded by the nostalgia, or was it a political stance? Do you know why he included them?
I think that, it's complicated. I don't know what he was thinking. I would love to know. Would love to have a conversation with him. But I do think that in Puerto Rico, we normalize, and I think everywhere in the world, we tend to normalize very problematic things around language, and we tend to say, oh, well, why are you getting so mad about that? No te pique, don't be angry, like don't let that offend you, when it is offensive. And I think that when you're socialized to internalize the sort of language, these tropes and these views, a lot of times you don't realize that you're doing it. And I think that that's in general, right? I think a lot of us, I have an article that I wrote about education with a gender perspective in Puerto Rico, because we have such a high incidence of femicides and gender violence, that's sort of taught already through school, right? From colors to gender to roles to work, distribution of labor, all these things that we know, right? That seem very like, oh, that's very simple. But those things are very much ingrained. So I don't know what he was thinking, but I think that for sure, I'm sure that for a long time he didn't think that these things were problematic, right? It's a hot woman dancing in a bikini. She looks great, blah, 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 all these things. But I think that now I would love to know now what he thought about that then. Like, would he do that now? Because his movies, his little short films in the beginning of his concerts have drastically changed. They have been about the history of salsa reggaeton. They have been about being Puerto Rican. And, I'm sure now with this concert, he's going to probably do something really cool with the history. So I think that like it's been a trajectory. And maybe now he wouldn't have done that. Or maybe he would have been like, well, that's where I was at that point. What's your second question?
My other question was, have you, in the communities in Puerto Rico and outside who don't know the history of Puerto Rico, have you noticed a change when this album came out of them learning more about the history and commenting on it?
Absolutely. It's been absolutely wild. All the emails that I've gotten from elementary students, middle schoolers, teachers, people that are not academics, just retired folks that just saying thank you, seeing themselves in the history. Because as Benita was saying, the history of Puerto Rico is unknown even to Puerto Ricans. And one of my arguments in a broader essay that I'm writing is that it's by design. It's those politics of forgetting that are in place in order to advance a colonial project in Puerto Rico. And so, yeah, the reaction has been incredible. So these visual...
outside of Puerto Rico.
Outside of Puerto Rico as well. I've gotten so many, and outside of the U.S., I've gotten, this gave me the opportunity to be interviewed by media outlets in Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Francia, Polonia, like Spain. And so a lot of people are like, we didn't know Puerto Rico's history. We knew that it was important in terms of the cultural dimension of reggaeton, but we didn't know the colonial dimension of Puerto Rico. We saw it as an extension of the U.S. for a lot of people. And so it's been great to see how it has been received. Also, I've gotten lots of pictures and videos of people perreando, like twerking in clubs, and then there's Puerto Rican history in the back. And then I think there's some beauty in it, also as well. And so I think that, the visualizers are part of, or they stem out of my book, Puerto Rico National History, which is sort of like a trade book published in Spanish and English. And so with the book, I thought that I had gotten to the pinnacle of my public history career. Because I had gotten emails from teachers and from people saying thank you, because it's a non-academic approach to the history of Puerto Rico. And so, non-academic in terms of non-jargony, I wrote this book so my grandparents could read it. And so the visualizers have done something completely different. And I think that for me, what it has proven is that there's a real thirst for Puerto Rican history, to know our history, and that people are really interested, but they're sometimes devoid of that from, it's structural. The problem is structural. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I was actually going to ask the same exact question, so I'm glad she asked it. I was actually going to ask the same exact question, so I'm glad she asked it. So I guess to continue off of that, how do you see the future in terms of holding on to this momentum that we have right now, in terms of this interest for like history and the history of Puerto Rico? How do we hold on to that so it's not just like a lightning in the bottle situation?
Do you want to go or?
No, you're the historian.
I know, but
You can take that one.
history's for everyone. We all make history. No, how do we hold to this moment? So I think that, in a deeper level, I think that, and I'm trying to think this through in this essay that I mentioned, and I'll speak tomorrow about this in the lecture. I think that, after 2006, there's an epistemic rupture in Puerto Rico where there's a vacuum in the way that we conceptualize our collective memories, our collective history. And I think that, one of the things that I tell myself at night to be able to sleep is that I think that now the work of cultural producers, scholars, and academics in Puerto Rico is of tremendous importance in terms of amplifying these histories. And again, this is also a history that has another sensibility from the history that I was taught. It's a history that is centering marginalized communities. It is the history that is being under attack in this country and in ours in Puerto Rico as well. So I think that it's a moment of amplifying it. And one of the things that Bat Bunny does is that he sets a standard and everyone copies Bat Bunny. And so in the elections, when he positioned himself in favor of independence, you saw artists like Mora, who you would never think would be advocating for the pro-independence party, also supporting. And so I think that, there's something problematic in rocking a straw hat, a bawa, in terms of, the dimensions that it reproduces, the myth of the great Puerto Rican family, this raceless democracy myth, which is very heteropatriarchal, racist, sexist, etc. But at a moment when Puerto Ricans are being physically and culturally displaced, I think there's some value in affirming the nation and affirming those national symbols. And so I think it's a catch-22, but I haven't answered your question because I don't know how to answer it. But I think that we need to amplify these conversations and in every sort of space that we can, in the classroom, outside of it. There's a lot of public history. I know that there is public history here in Central, and I think that public history is crucial. And the ways that we conceptualize history writ large. Now, all this to say, I don't know, but I'm thinking about it.
I think that in terms of there's stuff out there, I think it's so great that we have tools like TikTok. I don't know for how much longer, but that even with like Jorell's book, folks have been able to sort of do bite-sized videos of the book, for example. I think that there's people in Puerto Rico. I just think like there needs to be more dissemination, right? And obviously, like, who could compete with Benito's platform? Like, that is the biggest platform. I think that has also sparked interest in reading about history, in talking about it in ways that are accessible. I think that's the most important thing, because I always tell Jorell, like, your book is the book that I always wanted to read, the history book, because history books are so boring. They are so incredibly boring. And I never was interested in really like reading about a lot of the time, like in school, yeah, but it was so boring. It was like not fun. And I think that writing about it in ways that is engaging and fun, and I think that's what Jorell does, and meaningful and heartfelt and emotional and just relational. I think that's what we need to keep doing and move it away from like this stuffy academic, detached, supposedly objective when nothing is objective, right? Like that kind of thing. So I think that just needs to keep going and like continue with that momentum.
And using all the tools that we have in front of us, because a lot of people have written to me, a lot of teachers, that they're using these visualizers in the classroom, right? And so to get students, elementary school students, middle school students in Puerto Rico interested, because they're interested in Bat Bunny, not in history, right? And so that's the way of catching their attention.
There's a question right here, and then the one right.
Do you want me to pass it to you first? Because I think you want to say something about history books being boring, no? You sure?
No.
Okay. So
We can come back to some are.
I know. Not yours. No. So
Remember to use the microphone, but still be loud.
all right. So yeah, I'm going to have a problem with being loud. But you had me with your narrative and storytelling about erasing memories and borrando la herencia and all that, and the nostalgia came in and your visuals, and I was on a trip. But then you said something that sort of, I don't want to say maybe upset, but it was a bit like, wait a second, con mucho respeto y cariño, I almost say like, espérate, ¿qué carajo dijo? So again, mucho respeto y cariño, because you described the generation, I think it's the current generation, you were talking about a generation born in crisis and without a future, robbed of its future. And I was like, no, wait. Because my thing was, if I had a time machine and I could bring people from erasing the past and all that, and I could bring people, I don't know, in that transition of 1897 to 98, when, Muñoz Rivera and Santiago Iglesias were fighting for autonomy, they get it, and then we get the boom invasion from the United States. And then all of a sudden, it was like, oh, we have to start from scratch, and they start for crash. But speaking about a crisis and robbing the future, and then if you get then, I don't know, the Heto going as the first commission resident, and then you get Eugenio Maria de Hostos hoping like, oh, this transition is going to be good because these guys are like, we're going to get independence. We're still waiting. If you fast forward, you mentioned the massacre of Ponce and Alviso Campo being tortured. You fast forward to 60s and 70s. Those you mentioned now the crisis at the University of Puerto Rico in the 70s. The rise. If I could have Antonia Martina here, she was killed. Cerro Maravilla, So I was like, wait, isn't every generation in Puerto Rico born in crisis and being robbed of its future? It's not just unique to this generation. So, and I get it. I mean, those in power want to erase that past because if you don't know where you're coming, hey, I let me tell you, and I will guide you to the future. You mentioned the push that was for this current election, how if you vote for the PNP, it's going to be corruption. If you vote for the PNP, they're going to be more apagones. They still won. And what do we got? Corruption and more apagones. So can you sort of take that bad feeling that I have a little bit of, oh, this generation, no, it's all generations that have been born. We all be born in crisis. And so can you just put that back in the narrative so I just be happy a bit?
Thank you for that. I think I'll start with 1898, right? Because I think that for the longest time, there was this historiographical debate asking, was 1898 traumatic or not? ¿Fue un proceso traumático o no? Right? And it all depended on how you thought about it and your political inclinations and ideologies, right? On how you answer that question. But I think that for a lot of people, Puerto Ricans have been living in trauma for hundreds of years before 1898. It was yet another traumatic event. To your point, my book was originally titled Puerto Rico, 5 Centuries of Colonialism, 5 Centuries of Resistance. Because we've been resisting, and I begin with the Agüeybaná Rebellion in 1511, right? In which they, revolted against crisis, against genocide, against all of this. But I think that what's happening in Puerto Rico now in this crisis that was robbed of its future is that there's a design and a plan for that. And so one of the arguments that I'm trying to make is alongside Joaquin Villanueva, this geographer who has this argument that there's a criollo bloc in Puerto Rico. There's a managerial class that benefits from the colonial arrangement in Puerto Rico. And he's doing this research in which he's looking at a group of families that have held power in Puerto Rico since the 19th century until the present day. In my work, I look at the ideological contours of that and how the racial democracy myth that was created in the late 19th century is still operating today. So just to say that there's continuity in all these traumatic events, but I think that when you have a political class in Puerto Rico that has gotten to the 2000s, exacerbating a crisis. This is a crisis generation that was robbed of its future because it's a generation that lived through 2006. Law 7, Luis G. Fortuño, with the layoffs. It lived through, the unpayable debt when Agapito said in public television, we cannot pay the debt. And that's when all these vulture funds se aprovecharon that the Jones Law not only gave us citizenship, it also made bonds triple tax exempt in Puerto Rico, and that our Commonwealth Constitution of 1952 not only gave us rights, but it also said that the public debt needed to be paid before public services. And so it was a perfect storm that was created by these criollo bloc in order to benefit from this. And in the middle of it, you have a generation of students that is going to a school that is getting shut down, 400 of them shut down, a University of Puerto Rico that's operating with less than 60% of its budget 25 years ago. You have the biggest exodus in Puerto Rican history after, bigger than the 1940s to 1970s migration. You have Hurricane Maria, you have the earthquakes. This people were robbed of it, this generation was robbed of a future. And so I'm not comparing it, I don't want to be anachronical in saying that one generation had it worse than the other, but this generation was deprived. And I think in my larger work, I'm thinking about the politics of forgetting as an institutional project. In the 1940s and 50s, the Popular Democratic Party had, Operación Serenidad. They were trying to build an idea of the nation as part of their political project, and we can debate if it perpetuated colonialism, which it did. But I think that now the politics from the state is of forgetting. And so I think that's why I'm saying that they're being robbed of their past, their present because of the crisis, the future because of the country's collapsing, but also the past because of this politics of forgetting. Pero nada, eso era. So I think that it's not to say that it was better prior. It's just to say that now there is a structural project that is depriving this generation of that. Pero nada, podemos seguir hablando, but thank you.
So you've given us an enormous amount to think about, and I had one set of questions before Carlos asked his, and then he gave me another, but I'll just go back to the first one. I think one of the problems with history, both in the United States, in Puerto Rico, and elsewhere as well, is that if we're serious about studying the past, right, we have to study things that are unpleasant, that don't fit a kind of nationalist rhetoric of we're great, everything's going to be wonderful. And one of the things that is part of that is a history of enslavement, right? And I was just in January at the AHA, and there were some wonderful papers about slavery in Puerto Rico and slave resistance and women in Puerto Rico, right? And so I know that you're training graduate students. Rutgers has a wonderful program now. There are a number of places where you can study history, the history of Puerto Rico within the context of the United States and Latin America, more, I think, than when I was in graduate school. So I wonder to what extent the problem with the attack on history is in Puerto Rico, because it's clear here in the United States that it's about kind of digging up that old garbage that's in the back of the closet somewhere that everybody's been trying to hide for years, that when you bring out, it's like, ooh, wait a minute, right? And this goes into the colonialism of the Atlantic world. It's not just the United States, right? It's what Europe brought to the Americas, right? And didn't go away with independence. So I guess that's more of a comment than a question. But anyway, thank you.
I'm not a historian, but I'm married to one. I'll tell this because we've been in Puerto Rico for the year. I'm writing my book. Jorell's writing another book. And there was one thing we like in Puerto Rico. We love chisme. So if something happens, you will read about it on Facebook, on Twitter, on wherever. And there was this one thing that happened at the University of Puerto Rico where there was a presentation about the transatlantic slave trade, and a historian was called out because he did not change the way he talked about enslavement, right? As we now do not, in Spanish, we don't talk about esclavo, we talk about la trata, we talk about personas esclavizadas, the same thing as in English when we talked about enslaved people, right? And he doubled down. Like, Black women were saying, hey, this is not okay. You should not be writing about this in this language. we don't talk about it that way. And he was still like, no, I will speak about it however I want to speak about it. And that's not the way that it was spoken about in the 19th century. So that's just one little example of the pushback, even within the academic space, of how do we talk about, how do we narrate. Thank you so much for coming by. Nice to see you. How we talk about history in the ways that continue to perpetuate very problematic ideas, tropes, and discourses.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I absolutely agree that, history should make us uncomfortable. It should be unpleasant sometimes to read. And also, I think there's also some limits of what we should be saying just for the sake of advancing a narrative. Because I think about, epistemic violence. Sadia Hartman, when she, talks about how oftentimes we talk about enslavement, and, oftentimes in this article, Venus into actually talks about how Venus only appears dismembered in the archive. And so how do you write about Venus without just presenting her as a dismembered body? I'm not reproducing that violence. So I'm always thinking about representations in the way that I write. But to your point, I think that absolutely that's the case in Puerto Rico as well. It's because history fosters critical thinking. And so when you foster critical thinking, people start questioning things. And I think that that's the main problem. In my classes, if I teach a Caribbean history class and my student doesn't remember that the Haitian Revolution began in 1791, but then he or she or they remember that the impact of the Haitian Revolution for the Caribbean, the world, and for the idea of human rights, I feel myself accomplished. And I think it's because I'm interested in critical thinking, which is why there's this dangerous turn to positivism of like going back to like, what did the documents say? We need to be objective. This is what happened in the past. And so in Puerto Rico, it's all about, I think, the political status. It's about independence. Learning this history also makes you grapple with the way that the history of independence has been a history of deep repression. And when some people ask me, why isn't independence so big in Puerto Rico? And now that's changing slowly but steady. It's because of a history of repression. You could be arrested for flying the flag. You could, it's a lot of fear. And so I think that's why in Puerto Rico, it's similar to debate, but I think the contours is around political status, which also ties to history of enslavement, because, there's still, for the racial democracy myth of the great Puerto Rican family, you need the myth of noble enslavement. Slavery wasn't as bad in Puerto Rico as in the rest of the United States, which is a myth. I'm a Brazilian. Exactly. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And so it's tied to also histories of enslavement. But I think it's dangerous to have critical thinkers coming out of the classroom. That's why they're dismantling the University of Puerto Rico.
That's why it's a threat.
When we consider language restrictions, and when we're talking about you shouldn't say this or you shouldn't say that, and then we think about cancel culture, and when you or a group of people decide you shouldn't have a voice and you should not have a job and you should have not this, and when you think about Bad Bunny's initial music and how he talks about women, the violence, if we would have canceled him back then, what would we have today? How can we reconcile that? How can we say, okay, we should have some restrictions because it hurts this person, because we hurt their feelings, or because this or because that? Do we look at a person and we judge them based on one idea or the amalgamation of all of their ideas or all of the things that they have done throughout history? So it's something that I'm thinking about, like, if he would have been canceled, we wouldn't have La Velita, which is a beautiful, beautiful song, and other things, just moving the culture, the narrative, and moving that language forwards for other generations to kind of wake up and say, hey. So it's just something that I'm grappling with when we're limiting somebody's idea for them to express themselves.
Ooh, muchacho, you threw a bomb here because I think we have different opinions in this.
I think there are levels. I don't think Bad Bunny is saying racist things. I don't think he's saying, I think it can be constructed as misogynist for saying the word puta. I don't think he's saying women are inferior, they need to bow down to me. I think they're very different things. Versus someone who, I don't think it's about feelings. I think it's about humanity. So it's about the denial of humanity when we don't respect people's wants of being recognized as fully human. And so when we use and deploy language that minimizes other people's humanity, right? And I'm talking specifically about this professor, for example, or about other forms of language or of pronouns, for example, as well. That is something that is not, for me, it's a non-negotiable. It's not about you. It's not about if I'm making the other person feel bad. It's about recognizing that they are a human. I don't experience the world in the same way. That doesn't mean that I can't respect that. And so I think that, yes, there are definitely limits. Yes, I think that we shouldn't cancel other people unless they're really bad. And I think that, yes, we should give space for people to rectify and grow, apologize, and take accountability, right, for their mistakes. But I see a sort of retrenchment and resistance to respect how other people's humanity should be honored. And I think that's a problem. Versus Bad Bunny, saying the word hoe, and there's hoe positivity too, right? Whereas it's not the same, and it's not on the same scale, and it's not on the same register. This man was given an opportunity to change, and he did not want to change. And I think there is the problem. I think that Bad Bunny has been called out rightfully, especially around race, especially around like being not cognizant of racism. I think that he has started to change because he said, I can't speak on that. I'm not Black. I can't speak on racism in the music industry. But I think he's much more aware, and I think he's much more aware of centering Black people in his music, in his visual production, in honoring reggaetoneros like Tego Calderon, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think we need to nuance these things a lot and not just say, oh, this is this is that, and they're on the same scale. I don't think they are. Do you want to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so Guillermo just left, Irizarry, and so we've had this conversation a lot around Junot Diaz. And so how do we think about the work of Junot Diaz, right? The brilliant sort of production that he left us, and then, that moment, that the Me Too moment. And so that's why I said that we have different divergent opinions, because around Junot Diaz, I would still teach Junot Diaz, but also with like a caption. So we had many conversations around this. But to Aurora's point, I completely agree. I think it's about, if an action does not negate the humanity in another person, I think that, it's not worth canceling. And so I'm thinking, for example, there's this, Buenaventura Durrutia, Spanish revolutionary, used to say that fascism is not to be discussed, it's to be destroyed. And so how do you have those conversations in this particular political moment, right, in which you're having all these sort of political conversations? And so, this is outside of Bad Bunny, but I think there are certain political discourses or ideologies that attempt against the humanity of other people. And so I am okay canceling those folks. I think that, in terms of Bad Bunny, there's some scholarship around the politics of bodily autonomy and joy in reggaeton, early reggaeton. My abuela would be like, Bad Bunny, que mal hablao, I hate that guy, potty mouth, etc. But I think that there was also this sort of idea of, the politics of joy, and he's been changing, right? And to your question, or to your original question, we wouldn't have this conversation. This would have never happened if he had been canceled towards the beginning, right? But I think that he grew, and it's a process of learning. And one last thing is that he's very aware of this, because in some of his songs he talks about explicit lyrics. He's like, "Te dije que iba a hablar malo si tiene el parental." I told you I was going to speak, curse. I was gonna be cursing. It has explicit lyrics. And then in another song, he's like, "If you don't want your kids listening to this, it's your problem. It has the explicit lyrics," right? And so he's also aware of that in terms of of what he's doing, who he's talking to. But nada, I don't have a clear answer. But my line is when a discourse or an action attempts against the humanity of another people, another group of people, another individual. That's where racism, fascism, et cetera, et cetera. But Bad Bunny was, being a kid, he was early 20s. He reached astronomical fame overnight. He was still watching No Te Duermas, that problematic show. I watched it, and so for me,
He turned out okay.
and so it's a process of learning, and I think the most important part in terms of critical thinking is unlearning. And I think that he's going through that.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Two more.
Okay, okay. Contestamos rápido.
I guess I have like I don't know, from everyone that has spoke, we can start with the last one with language and cancellation and all that. I think yes at the beginning, just because he was part of this music record, which was Mambo Kings. It was very like trap based, it was very like the underground and like how everything grew up, which more like talking about guns, talking about drugs, talking about like having sex with women, trying to say this the most respectful way. But I think once he stepped into his own, he has empowered women through his lyrics. Like you mentioned with sex positivity, and maybe it's not the words that the older generation will have chosen to use, but it's words that we use every day, and it's like it thinks that everyone, like the older generation, us, like realistically, you have sex, you do this, you do that, like it's so he gave them power on owning and like that desire, but as well as empowering women with Solo de Mi, where he's just saying, I'm on my own self as a woman, and I'm not gonna take abuse from my partner. And then he had Yo Perreo Sola, which the song lyric-wise, it doesn't have great words, but the concept, he's saying, I'm a woman, I'm going out, and if I want to dance by myself, you cannot tell me what I have to do. Or like, I don't own anything a man because I'm outside like dancing with them. So, and those were like his earliest album compared to now. And like a transgression that I see and notice compared to other urban artists, you have like urban artists like we see in Yandel and Daddy Yankee, which I love and I grew up with them, but up to like their 40s, 50s, and they still sing about a 20-year-old you coming out of high school or whatever. Well, Bad Bunny, he's aware that he's almost 30, so in his last few songs, he's like, oh, you're almost 30, so you still look good or whatever. So he moves the transgression instead of like talking about younger women when he is like old. And I think that's some of the things that's in his language and his self-aware he shows through his songs and his growth. I think I lost my thing, but I had so many. Yeah, I lost it. But I think some of with the crisis, with the generation of crisis, like that's a generation I grew up and like, I don't want to say I'm a victim because I'm very grateful to where I'm at, but I was impacted by this generation of crisis of where I'm going to be lucky enough that my mom was able to own a home. And if I ever want to go back to PR, I can own a house by inheritance. But if I would like to go buy a house right now, I wouldn't be able because of gentrification and displacement and healthcare right now. I remember when I was younger, it wouldn't take me 6 months to a year to get an appointment. We could go, and within the same week, we could get an appointment. So it's those things that Puerto Rico has been on a crisis since their beginnings. But our generation, it's being obligated almost to either exile or just suffer and own it in that way. So I don't know.
I want to go back to your first part of the comment. So remember, for those of us that were there, or if you listen to 80s salsa music, it is hella sexist and it doesn't use curse words. Or other music. There's this song that would play on the radio that said, que inmenso será el dueño de la finca y la mujer. O sea, Bad Bunny's not talking about being the owner of a woman. This dude, back in whatever, the 60s, 50s.
Maelo.
Was it?
It's Maelo. And Maelo has another song about hitting the women.
And so, And so, And so this is not what Bad Bunny's talking about. So a lot of the times when the older generation, they get very offended by curse words. I don't care. And I'm sort of I'm an elder millennial. So I'm still, I still do enjoy very much that music. And I grew up on 80s hip hop and all that stuff. So to me, that's worse. To me, that construction of gender relationships is 20,000 times worse than, saying ho in a song and then saying, hey, I'm not going to say that anymore. I'm going to rectify it. Right? Because what we saw and what our parents and what our grandparents experienced, violence was very normalized. And I think we're moving positively in the ways that we're being more empowered to talk against and some men, cis men, are deconstructing their masculinity to not, continue and perpetuate those gender relations and roles. So I think that we have to look to the past and say, hey, the past was pretty messed up. So hopefully we're taking, steps in the opposite direction of that. So, yeah. Aleatra.
Yes. Hi. I just wanted to say that I'm so glad that I came to this talk. It's been very, very helpful for me. I'm of a very older generation. Obviously, I'm African American and I'm not fluent in Spanish. But for some reason, Bad Bunny, I favor from the beginning. Have always felt the power in his music, even though I didn't know everything that was being said. I have followed him, and I consider him a political musician on the lines of Bob Marley and Gil Scott-Heron from the 70s, and that he will be remembered that way if he continues, because the irony is he's growing as he's being the pioneer. So that's why things seem to be changing in new music, and I do believe that more people like myself, and I'm from the boomer generation, appreciate him, even though that's not something that the music we would listen to all the time. I always listen to him when he's on the radio. I have not, streamed his albums, but I hear enough of it that I understand that he is saying something powerful. And I felt it, and that's why I wanted to come to see what the conversation would be about.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for coming.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. If I can say something,
Rápido.
then I look rápido, quickly. Yeah. Okay. Just I think that thank you for your words and for being here. I'm glad that you made it, and I really love this idea that he's growing as he's innovating, because that's literally what's happening with Benito. And to your point about connecting with other people, I think that this album, particularly songs like Debí tirar más foto, I should have taken more pictures, more photographs, has connected so many people because it's a song that is also talking about exile and displacement. And when the song came out in social media, it became a trend for people in places like Palestine, Cuba, Venezuela, around the world. Because I think that exile, Edward Said used to say, is the condition that marked the 20th century, and I think that's still true in the 21st. And so there's some reference that are not universal, but they are universally recognized by marginalized peoples around the world. And so I think that he's very aware of that, and I think that his music has been able to connect with people throughout the world because of those experiences of displacement and exile and the themes that he's touching upon. But thank you.
So you briefly mentioned it earlier in your presentation. I wanted to know, because a lot of our history does end up getting untold. It gets, for lack of better words, swept under the rug, erased. How did you go by choosing which pieces of history you wanted to tell? You mentioned La Masacre de Ponce. You could have spoken about what's it called? La Ley de Mortaza, I heard you mention it earlier. La Carta de Autónomo. How did you go by choosing which pieces of history you wanted to add to the album?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the teaching of history and how there's certain tropes that began with the first book of history published in Puerto Rico in 1788, and they're still reproduced today. right? And so looking at sort of that longer genealogy of very problematic ideas that get perpetuated. But to your question particularly, thank you. I think it's very important for me. I wanted to highlight in my work, in this book particularly, because in my academic scholarly work, I do working class history because I come from a working class background. First gen, I'm interested in exploring those sort of particularly working class intellectuals. But in this book, which was sort of a trade book, a general history, this sort of long durée history of Puerto Rico, I wanted to tell it through the marginalized peoples. And so I wanted to tell the history through Agüeybaná II, who resisted Spanish colonialism. I wanted to talk about the racial hierarchy during the Spanish colonial times. I talked about Miguel Enriquez, who became the first millionaire in Puerto Rico and died penniless in an unmarked grave because he was African descent. And so Silvia Rivera, I have gotten emails from trans friends telling me, thank you. This is the first time that I see Silvia Rivera, a Puerto Rican trans woman, in a history book, in a general history book of Puerto Rico, right? So I was interested in amplifying the histories that I was not told growing up, that I did not have access to. And so, again, in my book, I didn't want to portray it as the history of Puerto Rico. That's why it's called A National History, not the National History, because it's my interpretation of history. And, I cannot wait for it to be unpacked, to be criticized, and read by another generation, because ultimately, and maybe I'll close with this, I know I talk a lot, si saben cómo soy, para que me invitan. It's, Fernando Bicó, one of our greatest historians, who was also un padre jesuita, Jesuit priest, used to say that every generation needs to retell the history of Puerto Rico. And I think that I was doing my part from my own sort of positionality, but it will be retold because I reproduce certain. So the last thing a moment ago, but the last thing I'll say is that I'm a disciple of Michel Trouillot, this Haitian anthropologist who used to say that any historical narrative is a bundle of silences. So the most difficult part is finding those silences and writing and asking why are people's events silenced. But no, I was just interested in amplifying marginalized voices and peoples.
All right. Thank you for the extra. We went over and
I understand.
thank you all for coming. This is I hope everybody got we were very happy that it was good attended and we had a good conversation back and forth. They'll still be here tomorrow, right? So you might want to catch them up and ask them a few questions and talk to them if you can get at 11. They're in the same room, the Philbrick camp room. We have Aurora at 11. Then we go into like a lunch at the center, and then we're having Jorell at 3. And then after that, they gotta go. So you gotta want to talk to them tomorrow. But again, thank you everyone. And again, let's give a